Nothing's worse than a head full of knowledge of your disease. So like this like head full of rehab knowledge, say you went to the room, say you've done counseling, and then you pick up. Because then your brain torments you. That conscious in our brain just torments you to the point where you can't even enjoy it. Right. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of people get to that point where they have so much knowledge of what they're doing is wrong and they're still doing it. And it's just ultimately leads to their demise of like, I can't do this anymore. Like not using is not fun and using is not fun.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important for those people listening um, to perhaps understand that when we're talking about relapse, a lot of people treat the actual moment of picking up that drink or drug as the relapse. But what I've realized from my own personal experience, as well as talking to other people who have relapsed before, is that the relapse happens way before we actually pick up that drink or drug, right? And we can actually emotionally or mentally or spiritually relapse way before we pick up and use.
All right, welcome everybody. This is episode 4 of Recovery Plus. Today we got a very special episode. We're not doing our traditional interview format. We're going to be having more of a discussion and good communication on along the lines of relapse, what that was like for us, what we've learned from that experience, prevention tools, just really advancing your guys' toolkit for the viewers of relapse because it is very common and I want to share our knowledge as lived experts, I would call us. We're not theorists. We actually have that lived experience that I think is so valuable. And I think you guys will get a lot from today's episode. So I'm here with Vaz Solo. I'm Jama Maxie, and this is episode 4. So we wanted to start it off really just. So, Vaz, how are you doing today?
I'm good, brother. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. It's a very busy day, but I'm excited for today's show.
Nice. Me too. Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting topic for people to hear about because, as you said, relapse is fairly common, even if you're working a program. So, yeah, I think people will get a lot out of this show.
Yeah, even just stigma behind the whole relapse thing. I think that's really important too. So my with my experience, I didn't when I actually committed to recovery in a program, and kind of went. I've heard the saying, people going 2 feet in, right? I'm sure you've heard the saying before. Some people go 1 foot into a recovery program, meaning they have some sort of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like reservations of if this were to happen, if that were to happen, I'd still be okay. So I really jumped 2 feet into a program of recovery, and I was really committed. So I didn't per se have a drug relapse after my commitment, but I know you did. So what was that like? Like, how did you get to that terrible spot where you're thinking to your head that it's okay now to put this substance in my body that you cognitively know is going to destroy you?
So, to start telling my story, I actually felt like I was both feet in when I went into the 12 step program. I also had this attitude of, is this program or nothing? I didn't, at least uh, I didn't explicitly think to myself, you know, someday maybe I will be able to drink again or use drugs again. I really did not want to do it at all. But I still ended up relapsing 6 months into recovery. Today I understand why that happened to some extent. When we talk about addiction and alcoholism, um, it's a very tricky condition. In our program we call it a disease, right? A malady. Um, it can lie to us in so many different ways that it's sometimes very hard to recognize what's true and what's not. And that was my case because when I worked the 12 steps, it produced this beautiful, liberating experience for me where my desire to drink and use drugs went away. And not only that, I actually felt so much better than I did when I first came into the program. Like I experienced that happy, joyous, and free feeling that people talked about. That's why I knew that there was something incredibly valuable there for me. That not only was I happy that I'd done it, but I wanted to continue to expand on that experience and pursue that path. However, 6 months into working the steps, this little snake of an idea entered my mind. And that idea was, you used to drink and use drugs because you felt miserable. You were full of anxiety, you had depression, you had no purpose. But now that you feel connected, now that you feel happy, maybe, just maybe, if you drink, it won't be the same story. I'm not going to end up drinking the whole 26er and end up at a bar and then waking up in a stranger's bed, right? So that was the delusion that crept into my mind. I feel different. Maybe now I can control my drinking, right? So I decided to try some experimenting. And to keep a long story short, my wife and I went for a wine tasting. Um, there was a small little voice in the back of my head that expressed some worry about what I was about to do, but there was a much louder voice saying, it's just going to be an experiment. And if the end result is that you can't stop after a couple of drinks, then all you did was you kind of told yourself or convinced yourself that yes, you are a full-on alcoholic and you shouldn't ever drink again. So when we did start drinking, I remember feeling good for the first 30 minutes, maybe an hour. But then suddenly I experienced this change in my awareness. Everything's like the walls started to close in on me. I started to feel this sense of negativity creeping into me because I'd arrived there feeling incredibly happy and incredibly positive, and suddenly I started to become negative. And so my solution for that was, well, maybe I just need to drink a little bit more, and it'll take me back to that nice, elevated, buzzed up state. But it didn't. The more I kept drinking, the worse I felt, but I still continued to drink. And so it all kind of ended up with us in our hotel room at the end of the night, me opening up yet another bottle of wine, and then my wife crying on the bed because, you know, she was recognizing that I kind of went back into my old ways. And so um that was my relapse, and I learned a lot from it. And I think I'll share what I learned at the end of this episode so we can talk a little bit more about uh, relapsing itself and what can trigger it, and also some of the preventative measures. But yeah, that's what happened to me.
So was it instantaneous when you had that first sip, that first kind of gulp of the substance that you were instantly brought back into it?
I can't say that's how it felt. It was more of a gradual progression towards the thought or the obsession coming back of just one more drink, and then it became just one more bottle, right? And then in the midst of that, there was periods of me trying to control how long I would have between the glasses of wine, right? So it just became this unpleasant, unmanageable, unhappy experience.
Yeah, I say that because I didn't recently, well, I guess not recently, but in the summer, I quit smoking for about 10 months. And cigarettes are very hard to quit. If anyone has tried to quit smoking cigarettes, it's extremely difficult. And I still remember the second I had my first cigarette after that 10 months abstinence period, and I wasn't doing any type of nicotine like vaping. I was like cold turkey in it. And as soon as it kind of like I had that first puff, like there was like if you had like a fMRI scanner on my brain, like it would have just been lit up because like the circuitry in my brain was so excited from that experience, and I instantly just knew like okay, like we're doing this now, we're doing this now. So do you kind of have that experience as well, like where you just said we're doing this now?
I would say for that for that day, yes. But my relapse ended that day. It's not like it continued the day after and then the next week. that was enough for me to learn that I couldn't drink like a normal person anymore. And also I realized that I didn't enjoy drinking anymore as well.
Hmm. So you had a little bit of intuition. I often wonder why they call it research. I went out and did some more research, and I think they say that is because to an extent, you have to really smash that idea that you can use safely, right? And sometimes our brains want more research and they want, like if you're writing a thesis, you want to get the most amount of research before you get, you know, your thesis statement or your finished product of your thesis, right? I feel like to some degree that's kind of similar with addiction, right? The addict wants so much research, so much experiences of these controlled phases in which we're in control of the substance and that we can put it down. That's really the research. And then at the end, you kind of have your thesis, which is I can no longer use these substances safely because I've done so much research.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it often takes the addict or the alcoholic getting to this terrible place of inner and outer unmanageability. So,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? So it's unfortunate that it takes us this long to figure out that it's probably not a good idea for us to pick up that drink or drug anymore.
yeah, it takes a lot of, just being beaten to a state of humility. Like, when you're truly ready and you've done all the research in the world, then you're ready to surrender, right? I love that word, ready to surrender to this thing.
Yeah,
And an abstinence-based program is very daunting. I think for a lot of people, that's what scares them a lot of what going to rehab looks like, and they want to bargain with the reality of abstinence. So a
yeah,
common thing you'll hear is, well, I'll be able to quit, say, cocaine, meth, heroin, opioids, but I can have a few drinks because I never really drank that much. Or I can smoke some weed, or I can do sort of different drugs, but still bargain with that reality of the abstinence-based program. And I think the abstinence-based program is the best program that anyone can really practice if they're really wanting to make cognitive change. Because what it does too is, I think I've seen this so much, so much, is that nothing's worse than a head full of knowledge of your disease. So like this like head full of rehab knowledge. Say you went to the room, say you've done counseling, and then you pick up because then your brain torments you. That conscious in our brain just torments you to the point where you can't even enjoy it, right? And I
yeah,
think a lot of people get to that point where they have so much knowledge of what they're doing is wrong and they're still doing it, and it just ultimately leads to their demise of like, I can't do this anymore. Like not using is not fun and using is not fun.
yeah. And I think that's why it's important for those people listening um, to perhaps understand that when we're talking about relapse, a lot of people treat the actual moment of picking up that drink or drug as the relapse. But what I've realized from my own personal experience, as well as talking to other people who have relapsed before, is that the relapse happens way before we actually pick up that drink or drug, right? And we can actually emotionally or mentally or spiritually relapse way before we pick up and use, and that's usually what precedes the actual relapse itself, right? And so maybe I know you have you told your story on episode 2 of how you were in a shooting, and how traumatic that was. And so you told me that you've emotionally relapsed before without picking up drugs or alcohol. So do you want to talk about that a little bit and what that was like?
Yeah, definitely. Um, so emotional relapse, that's a really good term, and I think we should definitely discuss it in great detail. I want to share another story after this, though. It's somebody's story that I heard, but it keeps me humble and grounded in why I got to do what I got to do every single day. But so for that specific example, I think I had about 2 years of sobriety underneath my belt, right? So I'm feeling pretty comfortable. And COVID, the COVID pandemic kind of started, right? So we all know that in order for addicts to kind of feel that connection, you have to be around people, right? Even if it's for me, even if it's just that I'm shaking another person's hand at a meeting, or I'm hanging around other people that have the same problem as me, or I'm just connecting in people that think similarly to me. That's for me the art of connection, and that was kind of robbed of me. Not to the extent that I couldn't talk to people on the phone. I was still talking to people and things like that, but I wasn't able to like physically see people anymore, and that was really hard. So um, I started to slip back into just like really bad thinking, I would say, just like my old way of thinking. Like the resentments got really big, the fears got really big. Just getting involved with my family drama sort of thing, and I was just like seeing myself kind of like emotionally spiral. And then that July, I got shot in Flemo Park, and after that, like one of my huge problems in early sobriety was anxiety. It was terrible, terrible, terrible anxiety the first couple months of sobriety, like having panic attacks in the library, not being able to like go anywhere, not even be able to take transit because I'm so scared of my shadow essentially. And this anxiety that I experienced early in recovery was coming like full fledged now. It was like hardcore. And it got to the point where I remember after the shooting, I kind of came home and I realized what happened and I knew I'm not okay. And I think for years it's okay to not be okay, even if you have like multiple years in recovery. I think that's something really important to stress because to some degree you may feel like weak or soft for asking for help with, extended period of abstinence, but I knew I wasn't okay. And a clear distinction of that was when after that happened, I wanted to walk my dog in the nighttime, the dark, and I couldn't even walk to the end of my driveway. I was getting so scared of everything. Like everything became like a predatory domain. Like every person, place, or thing in my neighborhood just became scary, and especially that dark because the shooting happened in the dark. So now I'm like scared of the dark, and I'm like thinking to myself like this is not good. Like I gotta be able to walk my dog at nighttime. My dog needs to go out. I can't even walk my dog, and that's really when I realized like I'm slipping. You know, I'm slipping. I'm going back to that old Jama that was scared of his shadow, was scared of going out in public, was scared of everything. And that's when I realized I need to, verbalize this with people that I love and support me, that I'm struggling really bad right now. And I think one of the major things that I did is that first call of help, like just like step one, like admitting something, right? I had to admit that my anxiety had gotten me to the point where I can't even walk around the block, you know? And I think that's where it really all started.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how things can get incredibly unmanageable, even if we're sober. I have this line that I like to use: sobriety is a choice, recovery is a process, right? So if I just stop using drugs and alcohol and I'm a real drug addict and alcoholic, things tend to get worse, not better for me, because the reason I'm picking up, there's underlying issues that I haven't dealt with, right? I cannot deal with my negative thoughts and emotions. um, there's always something missing from my life, that no matter how much money I make, or if I have a family or whatever it is, if I'm successful, it doesn't fill that void that I'm constantly feeling when, for me and for you, we're not spiritually connected, right?
Yeah,
Like
for me,
that.
it's the anxiety, right? For everyone, it's different. I think everyone kind of has different like baseline of what their mental disorders or what their mental state is that they're running away from. But I know for me, like if I'm not in recovery and doing the things that I need to do to stay well, my anxiety is just waiting for me, like just waiting for me. And when I tell people about my anxiety, a lot of the times they look at me like, you used to be an anxious person, like I do a lot of public speaking now, and I'm a very good group facilitator and things of that nature. And I can talk very well in front of a group, and I'm very confident, and socially, I'm confident in that way. And I tell people like I was having, like I was scared to go outside. I was so scared. I had like agoraphobia, I think it's called, where you're having panic attacks of having panic attacks in public because I was having these panic attacks in like transit, you know, restaurants. Like I couldn't like, and as a man, I was like so scared of people judgment. That's also the being stuck in self, right? Because in my eyes, when I have a panic attack, like the whole world is watching. Like all 7 billion people of you guys are watching and laughing at me. When the reality is maybe one person even notices, right? So that's what I'm running from, and I think every addict kind of has a specific hell that they're running from. For me, my hell is anxiety.
Okay, but that's interesting that you mentioned that, and I agree. Right, we all have our own specific, unique circumstances and issues that we need to deal with once we go into recovery. However, I heard a speaker. He's from AA, named Chris Raymer, talk about relapsing, and he's a fantastic speaker. If anybody is interested in learning more about the 12 steps or hearing something inspirational, Google him, Chris Raymer. Um, the core of his message was this. He says, and he works in a treatment center like you and I. He says, listen, you can go to treatment and work with a therapist and try to deal with your grief, with your broken family trauma, like all of this stuff that, you know, addicts tend to have in their lives. He says, but if you don't have a spiritual experience or a spiritual connection, you're going to pick up. And vice versa. He says, you know, people in the 12 step program, they they have trauma, they have anxiety even when they're sober and still working the steps 2 years, 3 years into the program. But if they have a spiritual connection, they're not going to pick up regardless of how crappy they will feel on a day-to-day basis. Does that make sense? Like, do you believe in that? Do you
Yeah,
agree with that?
absolutely. Like that's what keeps me um grounded now. Like that's like my main combat of like those experiences is that spiritual connection, right? Like I always have something I can go to like constantly. Right now I'm sitting in I'm the Indigenous Resource Center here at York, and I have like our medicines, our 4 traditional medicines, and I can do a smudge. I can get grounded in that way. I can always connect to my higher power and stay tapped in. And I think that's really what stops me from any type of like I know that if I'm even thinking that way, like I'm going against what the creator wants for me.
Mhm.
Like the creator doesn't want me to much less pick up, but even think that way.
Yeah, or
That
even
it's
just,
okay to pick up.
and I found even simply for me, when I start to obsess over worldly things, right? Like such as money, such as relationships, such as work, and I start to think about that and worry about it, that immediately disconnects me from that spiritual connection or experience. Whereas if I leave, if I put my faith in God and accept what comes, we were talking about this before, right? Acceptance and surrender are huge for those of us in recovery. If I have that kind of attitude, everything seems to work out the way that it should, right? I'm pedaling and God is steering the bike, right?
Absolutely. Another thing I think about, and our good friend Donovan has said the same to me a bunch of times. Um, I don't have another recovery left in me, and he said that multiple times, and I've caught it, stole it from him, to be honest. But I love that saying because for me, I just when I even think about the process of me recommitting, like I don't have another recovery left in me. I know I'm a young guy, but the situations in which like I don't have like 20 grand sitting around for me to go to treatment and for me to wash me up at a detox and put on some fresh pair of clothes. Like I come from poverty, so like that's where my life is heading, so I have that kind of fear um masking and keeping me away from that demon of picking up again. But and also another thing too is I've seen this experience is once you have like multiple years, a lot of knowledge, there's so much humility in recommitting because like you've been sober how many years now? Five, right?
Five and a
Five
half.
and a half? Yeah, five and a half. So you have all this experience and then you got to come back, right? You got to come back into a rehab or a treatment center and be like, I'm here. And to me, that's like the hardest walk any man can take because you're like, I used to have knowledge. I used to, be this person. Now I got to recommit. So it takes a lot of humility. And I think for people that, become counselors that have kind of this knowledge of addiction treatment, it's even harder for guys like you and I to, show that humility because we do know so much. But as we know from Bill's story, knowledge does not um, solve all of our problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those weird things where when I'm a counselor, I am put in this position of, I don't, I think generally it's suggested that we don't become friends with the people we're counseling,
Hmm.
right? I need to earn your trust if I'm going to work with you, but at the same time, uh, we almost shouldn't be seen at the same level. Like, I don't know, is that true, right? I think
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of yeah, that's common. Yeah, that's something you would say, right? As
that's kind
a
of, yeah, because, but I find that sometimes it's better for me to feel like I'm, well, at least inwardly, even if you don't see it, inwardly to feel like I'm no better, no smarter than you, and that I'm just your friend, right? Spiritual friend and guide here to sort of share some of the things that have helped me so that it's not like this top down authoritarian experience.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like that's one of the things I wrestle with. Like, look, obviously we have a job in which we have to help these people, guide them on the red road, essentially. It's an indigenous way of saying recovery. However, for me to look down on somebody just feeds into my already existing ego. So I can't just like continuously look down in an authoritative way. Like to some degree, I just like when I sit and I listen to people tell their stories of, their experience of using and how they got here, like I'm putting myself in their shoes. And I try and do that to the best of my ability when I listen to people is be empathetic, right? Like to me, empathy is putting yourself in that person's shoes. Like, what does your construct of the world look like currently? And let me sit beside you and kind of see what that looks like for you. And if I can relate to that, I will relate to that. And oftentimes I can when I actually sit there and listen to these people. For me to like think I'm better than someone, I'm not going to have that sort of empathy that really is needed in a counseling role, which is let me see what your side of the world looks like right now. And then I'll deconstruct what you're thinking of because usually it's something along the lines of the whole entire treatment center sucks. Everyone sucks. Everyone hates me. I'll never get recovered. I'm useless. I self pity. Like they're just riddled with character defects, right? And then I try and you know call out some of these cognitive distortions that I see, but I don't really believe in the notion of like authoritative or anything like that. I wanted to share one experience though, switching gears a little bit. So I had this experience. It was last year. I was at my foster brother's uh, I think it's called a buck and doe. Buck and doe, yeah. So it's like a fundraiser for the wedding, right? And so my foster brother's uncle was married for like multiple years, and they got a divorce. And so I knew these people kind of when I was in their foster home. And so he got remarried. So the new wife or whatever of my foster brother, in which I lived with, um, his his uncle's new wife was there, and she had never seen me before. So this was our first time kind of meeting at this family gathering sort of thing. So she saw me and she's like, "Are you Jama? You know, Beth talks very highly about you." And I was like, "Thank you, thank you." She goes, "Yeah, you're the only kid that Beth said has ever kind of gone to university and all those sorts of great things you're doing in your life. I hope you know that. That's very special." And I said, "Thank you." And she goes, "How come you're not having any, or you're not drinking?" And I said, "I don't drink." And she goes, "That's amazing, young man." And she goes, "May I ask you, like, why not?" And I said, I'm in recovery, man." And she goes, "I want to tell you something." And she's like, she told me about because she just got remarried, right? And she's like, "I had this ex-husband. He was sober. He got sober when he was like your age. He was a young guy. He was a young guy. He was doing everything right. He was going to um, he did all the processes in which our recovery program requires. He was doing everything amazingly. He had the family, he had the wife, he had the the beautiful life, the beautiful job, career flourishing, and then we had this beautiful thing called COVID-19 happen. And when COVID struck, that's really when he just had that emotional lapse. We were talking about it early in the show, the emotional lapse. And when he had this emotional lapse, he had constant nagging thoughts of like, do I really need recovery? It's good now. I'm 20 years into this, 25 years into this, and eventually, just like it was like a mental blank spot. I think she said it was like a Friday after work. He just kind of was feeling himself. He felt excited, Friday payday kind of thing, and he went to the LCBO after work and he tried to have a few beers. And to cut the story short, is he had a terrible, terrible relapse, and he was using just the way he was when he was in his early 20s, if not more. He got DUI'd, I think multiple times, to be honest, and his family wanted nothing to do with him. He was isolating, he was causing trouble, getting in trouble with the law, and earned his way into a divorce. And so this girl had told me about her ex-husband, and she said, "Young man, please don't do what my ex-husband did. Like whatever you're doing, just keep doing it because it looks good on you."
Yeah, that's definitely a good cautionary tale that time doesn't really mean anything. When we say I'm 20 years sober, I'm 10 years sober, you think, oh, like you're bulletproof, but it's not at all. That's why I think the degree of our recovery depends again on the degree of our spiritual connection and fitness. I've been in the program long enough to have understood that really well. And I see people come into our center who relapsed and they feel like they've lost that connection and they're just a complete mess, right? They're a
Mm.
complete mess and they're suffering because that emptiness is back. That feeling of restless, irritable, and discontent is back. And when I'm in that state, it's very hard for me to feel hopeful about recovery. It's very hard for me to even remember how good it felt to have that connection.
Yeah, you lose your hope really. Um, let's talk a little bit about triggers for the viewers, 'cause I know that's like a common thing that people come up to us as counselors, as sponsors and things like that. Like, I got all these triggers. Like, what would you say to someone who, I got all these triggers, emotional, mental, situational. What would you say to somebody that's talking like that?
Okay, well, I'll give a very specific story. It's very short. I I was I was working and I came up to this guy and I said, "How are you doing today?" And he said, "Oh man, I've been having all of these cravings recently." And so my question to him was, well, like, what do you think is causing it? And he said, well, last night I was watching a lot of hip hop videos, rap videos,
Hmm.
with the half naked girls shaking the booty in your face,
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff. And I said, that's it. That's the trigger. That's why you're having these cravings. And I knew that because I've gone through it myself. For me, my cocaine use was directly tied to a sex addiction, to an addiction to pornography, to an addiction to risky sex. And so I remember that early in my recovery, if I saw any kind of sexual images, just like he had when he was watching those videos, that would immediately or later on the next day would be followed by thoughts about using or cravings, right?
Yeah.
So that's a trigger, right? That's a trigger when we expose ourselves to things that we associate with that past life that we were living.
Yeah, yeah. But from a classical conditioning standpoint, like this is before neutral stimulus that becomes conditioned into us as it's like Pavlov's dogs, right? You get conditioned into that this neutral stimulus is now the conditioned stimulus. So every time, you see the naked woman or the uh, the girl shaking their butt. You've used so many times that you've conditioned this stimulus so that it's now so tied to your using that it's all you can think about, right? It's very similar to like when Pavlov started to ring the bell, right? The dog started salivating, right? The addict starts salivating, it starts thinking that this stimulus now, the bell ringing, um, the lustful, videos or imagery is conditioned with that, and now it's stuck in our brain. We have to recondition that, right? It's so common that people have those sort of experiences, and certain triggers are different than others. And I think for me, like a lot of my triggers were just family. Like my family was like really triggering for me. Like to be around my family, I just it was a lot. So I had to like stay away from them because they're still using, right? So for me, I had to like distance myself from that, like those and those situations in which, obviously there's substances on the table or in the fridge and things like that. So I have to be away from those situations. But I had someone come up to me yesterday and said, no, it was yesterday. Jama, I can't pinpoint a certain trigger on my reintegration plan. So his proposition was like, you know how most people you like during a reintegration plan, you're like, what are your triggers? And you'd probably be able to identify those very quickly. Like they are like jackpot of thoughts. Like they just come into your mind quickly, like boom, 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 boom. Like this individual was like, I can't think of a specific trigger. And I think he was thinking more along the lines of situational. And I challenged him. I said, do you think it's the emotional trigger that makes you drink? And he paused and he thought about that. And I said, I kind of, we dug deeper into that. And I don't think he knew that like sometimes it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It doesn't have to be a video. It doesn't have to be a family member. It doesn't have to be an old friend. It doesn't have like it can be that emotion, like that neurotic emotion, and whether that's anxiety, whether that's loneliness. That's a common one. Lonely. I feel so lonely, so I'm gonna relapse. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought that was cool.
And that's it's a good segue to what I also wanted to touch on is that I was going to say the same thing. It doesn't have to be driving by that LCBO that you used to always buy booze at, right? Or that video. Sometimes I just woke up and I felt like crap. I was tired. I had more anxiety than usual. For whatever reason, I wasn't mentally and emotionally stable that day. And that's going to happen, especially in early recovery, because, even scientifically, we understand that the brain needs time to heal for all of the hormones and everything to come back into its healthy balance. And there will be some days where I just don't have it, my brain is not producing enough dopamine, right? Because it's not healed yet. And so it's very easy for me to make the mistake of thinking that because I'm in this state, something outside of me is causing it. Because that's generally what people do is they'll project the way they feel onto the world, right? So they'll think, oh, it's because my job isn't the right job, or it's because my
Yeah.
girlfriend said something to me yesterday. But it's never, almost never about that. It's usually just a delusion. I'm projecting my internal state on the external,
Right.
right?
Just comfortable internal states, right? And that's really like what I was kind of stressing out with this individual is like what internal state do you sit in before you use, right? And if you're able to identify that, then you've now identified like your emotional triggers in which your emotion, like, because that's so important, like that, what's your internal state that makes you kind of think about it, want to numb, right? For a lot of people, it's numbing, right? It's numbing that neurotic emotion and stuff like that. Um, I wanted to mention one thing about almost very, very close to relapse. I was about 7 or 8 months sober at this time, and I was at the college. And at this point, I had previously in my life, I had tried college 2 times, and both times I failed like terribly. And the reason I say that is because it attaches to this story. So I'm at the college, and I've kind of just been emotionally not well, like just not at my my peak performance of emotion, regulating my emotions. And I get this like assignment, right? And it's like worth a weighty chunk of our grade. And I hand it back into the teacher, and me and this teacher had kind of had it out for each other, right? Like, I didn't feel like I was in resentment. Like, I didn't feel like she liked me, and I felt like she didn't. We just we didn't see eye to eye, right? Me and this teacher, and I hand in this assignment, and she virtually wallops me with a 55 or something like that on this very weighty final grade assignment, and I try and talk to her. I'm like, I don't deserve this grade. You know, the self righteousness, the the selfishness started to come out. A lot of my character defects were flourishing, and she was like, no, like you did deserve that grade. And we kind of had a back and forth exchange in which, I was getting very good at like handling these situations of like disagreements and whatnot. But this time, I just kind of lost it. I pretty much said like, you don't know what you're doing. I got a good grade. You don't know what you're doing. You're incompetent. Right? And the situation ended with like, she's like, this is your grade kind of thing. And so I couldn't accept that. And my self pity started to go back to that old Jama. Like once I realized that I have like this really bad grade, like my brain went so quickly into that emotional state in which I used to be in when I was using, which is you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not made for college. Nobody in your family has ever done college. Why would you even try? You're stupid. You come from low social economic status. This is not your field. So when I got this grade, like all this negative self talk just started flourishing like ooh, like crazy in my head. I sat down and I went up to her and I said, you know what? This is where the self pity comes in, which is one of my major defects of character. I said, you know what? You're right. I did deserve this 50 because I'm stupid and I don't deserve to be in college. And I knew I was too dumb to do this. You know, maybe I should just go back to the old way I was living. That's what I told this person.
Hmm.
And I stormed off. And I at that point, I just like in my head, all I could see is failure. All I could see is me failing college for a third time and that the pain that would come with that. And I couldn't deal with that. I couldn't deal with being a three-time failure. So I'm walking around and I just said, you know, I remember calling my brother and I was like, essentially like, yo, you got me back. Like I'm here. I'm gonna pick up. I'm walking to LCBO. Like, let's do this kind of thing. Like, and I had made my decision where like I got so emotionally disturbed where I made that decision to pick up. And I was literally walking. I stormed out, I grabbed my book bag, and I started walking to. I didn't know, like, the town I was in, I didn't really know where LCBO was. So I was just, like, aimlessly walking, you know what I mean? I didn't
Well,
have a car at the time.
hold on before you continue, just so the listeners and viewers know, this is the technical term for what you were going through is called a case of the fuckets.
Yes, a very strong, strong case of the fuck it's, right? Like, I already told my teacher to kind of fuck off, and I had the fuck it world started to come back. The fuck it circuitry in my brain was like full fledged. And as I'm walking, I have no idea where the LCBO is. I'm just walking out and I make a few phone calls to people in recovery. And I'm like, nobody's picking up. Like, I honestly, you know, those days where you just call people and like no one picks up. And I called the guy, one of the first people I met at my first meetings. And he was like 20 years sober. He was an older gentleman. And he was actually on a ladder. He was a painter. He was painting. He was on a ladder, and he took the call. And he said, "What's going on, Gemma?" And I told him kind of what's going on, and he told me to do the third step prayer, and and to review that third step kind of thing. That was his sort of suggestion. And I remember I was at like this like park bench, and there's like cars driving by and shit, and I just get on my knees and I just do this third step prayer, you know, and I offer myself to thee to build with me, and it just went away. It just went away. Like I just like, you know, I'm not doing that. That's a cognitive distortion. You're not an idiot. You'll bounce back. You don't have to say fuck it just because things aren't going your way. The fuck it circuitry is not one that's sustainable, you know, and you belong in school. You're worth it, you know, and that's kind of the validation I sort of needed. And grabbed my bag. I went back to school and I told some of my classmates because they're all like, "What happened to you?" I told her, I had a little mental breakdown. I'm good now. And that was like good example of like an emotional trigger. Like that had nothing to do with like a situation or like I was at, a wedding or something and someone offered me a drink. That was just like me just being emotionally filled with self-pity. Like if I could pinpoint the key character defect, like my self-pity, which is I said is very huge in my life. Like I know it's one of my major character defects, was just so strong and I just couldn't handle it, so I wanted to numb it. So emotionality, very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this would be a good time to talk about some of the tools that are available to us when we feel like we're about to pick up again and to relapse. And you mentioned a couple of them right there. You said, when you were feeling that way, at least you had enough sense and willingness to call somebody in the program.
Yeah, I owe it's a moral obligation for yourself if you're going to commit yourself to a recovery program and have people that care about you, love you, and want to see you do genuinely good. Like just for, like they have no like external motivations. Like when you're sponsoring people or you just have friends in the program or you just have like people in your corner, it's a moral obligation that you call these people. And one of the things that I stress in my sponsees is like, I have sponsees in the relapse and I'm like, well, did you call me? And the answer is no, and I go, well, what am I supposed to do? And sometimes it hits them, sometimes it doesn't. But like the reason I say that is because like, Baz, are you a psychic?
Nope.
Neither am I. So like, how am I supposed to know like you're having an off day or off moment in your recovery, right? How am I supposed to know you walked into a triggering spot, right? I don't know these things, right? Um, so I really can't. You can't help when you don't know it's there. I remember this really funny story where this girl had she had relapsed and she had blamed her sponsor and her share for the relapse, and it was just like the story, like she made it seem like the sponsor was like she was like in some trap house and she shouldn't have been there, and she painted a picture of like the sponsor should have got like some psychic reading from, you know, like I gotta go, like jump in their car, drive there as fast as they can, kick in the door, dive across the trap house, and you knock the drugs off the table and save them. It was like the onus is on you. Like you made that decision, and it's not really the sponsors. It's not, you can't really blame your sponsor for that, right? Like you decided you were going to pick up. But when we're talking about tools, like one of the major um, things we should really talk about is avoiding those triggering situations, right? I think that's something I really talk to people a lot about in early situations. Like I know for a lot of young people, like it's a cultural thing to be in bars around drinking and stuff like that. Like I tell the young people that I work with, like I was not a popular guy in my first year. Like I got rid of virtually all social engagement outside of like hanging
Meetings.
out meetings and hanging out with like similar people like you that have the solution solved in, right? So I did have like, I'd go, we do like small fellowship things like go to a restaurant or whatever with people like-minded people, but people that would slap the shit out of me if I picked up a drink, right? You know what I mean? So I just stayed engaged with those people. Like they became my new tribe and did not leave my tribe. And so like for those people who haven't heard that saying, right? Like if you hang around a barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. For myself, like I knew that distinctively the way I grew up. The, like I knew if I hung around certain people, certain places, and certain things, like somebody's gonna hand me some shit, and I'm gonna say, you know what, it'll be different this time. So for me, like I didn't go to weddings, I didn't go to parties, I didn't go to those social events at all because I knew the process. I knew like because now I'm able to go to concerts. I'm able to go to vacations. I just came back from Colombia. By the way, the only place where a Uber driver is going to offer you cocaine you know. I get out of the Uber, the guy's helping me with some bags, and he's like, "You need weed cocaine, amigo?" I was like, "No, no, no, brother. Like, I haven't even settled in, brother. Even if I did one day, like, come on, man. I just left the airport, you know." So, but yeah, like I can handle those situations now, because I've actually put in a duration of work that allows me to be there. A lot of people just want to jump right back into the all-inclusive weddings, the all-inclusive bar. Like, like it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, are they doing this because there's still a part of them that wants to vicariously enjoy that scene, right? And often the answer is yes. However, in our book, the big book of AA, it does say that, we, as long as we are spiritually fit, we can go to these places provided that we have a good enough reason. So the question I have to ask myself, is it really important for me to be here? Right? Am I here because I want that vicarious enjoyment? Or am I here because, it's my sister's wedding and I don't want to miss that, right? Because it's really important. So I think at the root of it is this a selfless thing or am I being selfish?
I say, and then that's very good for that. And my sponsor used to say this to me, is check your motives. Jama, check
Exactly.
your motives. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Like, why do you want to go to your friend's, 23rd birthday party at the club or whatever it was? Like, why do you want to go? And when you actually think about something, this is a real cool thing about our conscious. If you actually listen to that thing and you actually honestly answer a question like that, and it's going to take a lot of deep diving, like there was a lot of motives that weren't for selfless reasons, right? And they were all bad motives. They're all ego oriented. Like I wanted to show like my friend group how strong I am. I could be around drugs and alcohol and I'm tough and greatest sober guy that ever lived, And it was like, no, you idiot. Like you are not anywhere near one of those events. So um, that's like really key for me just to think about those situations and as my in my prevention toolbox and my prevention toolbox as well is just staying connected, right? Staying connected with people today like yourself, staying connected to other people that are just gonna, call me out for my shit, that are know when I'm not doing this recovery thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to what you were saying about checking your motives, any situation can be either harmful or positive depending on what the motive is, right? So, one of the triggers for people they say is, isolating. You were just saying, I need to stay
Yeah,
connected. I need to be around other recovered
yeah.
people.
Loneliness is huge for
Right.
a lot of relapse.
But for me, I knowing myself, I get actually more worn out when I'm around too many people for too long. So I also have to know
For
my
sure.
limits about how much I can handle. And sometimes I like coming home to recharge. And if it's not to sit there in self-pity, but to meditate, to read something spiritual, to do some yoga, to pray, like these are all good ways of isolating, right? You know what I mean? So it's all about listening, learning to listen to the conscience. Why am I doing what I'm doing or making the decision that I'm making? If we learn how to be honest with ourselves, and that'll come from being connected to um, our conscience as well as God, then we are far less likely to make bad decisions, I found.
Yeah, for me, check your motives is check in with your consciousness. Like that was something that was often put towards me is check your motives. To me, that means check your consciousness, check your spiritual connection, check what this higher power would have to say about you right now.
Yeah,
What
and
would-
so
what is his plan? So that's to me is the spirituality of that.
yeah, and while we have this big toolbox of tools such as going to meetings, calling our sponsor, um, and avoiding triggers, etc., right? Um, I found that the most powerful tool for me was to go straight to the source uh, through prayer.
Yeah, that's
Like
what saved me.
Right? Exactly. So you said, I called my sponsor. My sponsor told me to read the step 3 prayer. So it was basically like you went sort of in a roundabout way to the solution, right? Which is fine because that's what you needed. You needed to hear from somebody at that moment. Um, for me, generally, I just went straight to prayer because
Yeah,
I knew that if I called my sponsor, he would just tell me to pray. And I'm like, okay, so I might as well just pray sincerely and ask for the solution. And it saved
yeah,
me many, many times. Even in the example where I would see some sexually explicit images, it would lead to thoughts about using, which were again tied to thoughts about sex, right? Or lust. And I would immediately, before even entertaining the fantasy or thinking about it further, I would immediately go to God, please remove these thoughts from my mind. Help me to feel that connection and freedom, take away this craving. And I did that every single time, and every single time it worked.
absolutely. And it will continue to work. Like that's really the outlet, the essence of, recovery is staying tapped in with your higher power, because in my experience, like my higher power was the only thing that kept me sober after the shooting. Like literally the only thing, because one of my brother and my mom were like, how are you still sober, Jama? Because they got, and they were in the shooting too, and they kind of self-destructed, I'll say, after it, right? And they're like, how are you? Because when I'm tapped in, I'm undefeatable in that I'm in acceptance. I'm in radical acceptance. I'm in a state of consciousness, God consciousness, that to me is the strongest path a human being can take, because I'm no longer trying to say like I got this. I'm getting help constantly. I'm not alone, even though I felt so lonely after that shooting, so lonely after being, kind of having these PTSD symptoms and feeling like they're never going to go away. And if I didn't have my higher power, I'd be out there, man. So, so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even pointed it out when you said that as soon as you said that step 3 prayer, you started feeling different and thinking different. And so you were not only connected, but you were in truth at that point.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. So before that, self pity, anger, sadness, all of that stuff skewed your decision making, skewed your perception of what was actually happening. And once you prayed, it aligned you back with truth, where you felt empowered, where you understood that this is only a brief moment through which would pass, and it didn't mean that your whole life had to fall apart because of it.
definitely, definitely. So your outcome and conclusion of your, that relapse story you were talked about earlier. What's that like?
So for me, it also involved being saved through prayer. When I had that relapse, the next morning, I woke up and I said to myself, I never want to drink again because I didn't even enjoy drinking. And so what I started to do was I started to practice everything that I was practicing up until that point, which is, going to meetings, meditations. I was sponsoring people at the time, I'm pretty sure. I was doing pretty much everything that I was doing before that. But you know what the strange thing is? I did not feel good. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I was like, I'm doing everything that the program teaches me to do, but I don't feel good. Now, here's the caveat to that. I told my
Mhm.
sponsor what had happened, and he said, "Oh, okay, like I'm sorry to hear that, and I guess you'll be picking up that newcomer chip." So, for those who don't know what that is, in the 12-step program, we get chips for periods of sobriety. So, let's say you were 30 days sober, you get a 30-day chip, a 1 month, or sorry, 2 month chip, 6 month chip, etc. So, up until that point, I already had my 6 month chip. Now, I told him, I said, well, I don't think that was really a relapse because it was just I said it was just an experiment. So I don't think I really need to pick up that chip because I'm just right back into the program and I'm fine. And he said, okay. He didn't even push me into it. He said, okay, that's your choice. I said, okay, cool. So like I said, I continued to do everything that I was doing, but for 2 weeks, I felt worse and worse and worse. So for some reason, the program wasn't working. Now, it got so bad that at a certain point, I remember I was driving to work and I had to pull over into a park. And
Yeah.
I sat in that park feeling like I wanted to jump out of my skin. And like I felt like I was going to pick up at that point. And I started to pray and really seriously just ask God. I said, God, please show me what I need to do because I can't go on feeling this way. If I'm going to work this program and still feel like shit, then I might as well start using drugs again. What do I do? And then boom, the thought flashed into my mind, pick up that newcomer chip. As soon as that thought came to me, I felt 50% better. I felt a sense of relief. So the next day I went to a meeting. It was very difficult for me because obviously there was a lot of pride and ego blocking me. But I got the chip and like I was back. I was back into that beautiful state that I felt as we were driving to do the wine tasting. Right. So to me, that showed me how honest I have to be, how connected I have to be to my conscience, that it's not just about the drinking or using drugs. It's really about living a life of truth, right? Of connection, where I'm no longer lying to myself. I can't sell dope and stay sober. You know what I mean? I can't yell at my family and then not apologize, right? And stay sober. I can't do these little things that a lot of people can get away with if I'm the real deal, because all of these things, my pride, my dishonesty, my anger, my resentment, take me further away from God. And when I'm further away from God, then I don't have any recovery. And it's only a matter of time. So that was really the big lesson for me out of that whole relapse.
Yeah, like I say to people a lot of the times too, is I don't have the luxury today to be angry. Because for some people, they can be angry, they can live in that angry state. But for myself, I know if I live in there, not only there's no middle ground for me. There's no like he's gonna be a little bit angry. It's gonna be like I'm gonna smash you over the head with a brick angry. Like that's where my brain goes when I'm in resentment, right? Like I just I can't go there. I don't have the luxury of being spiritually disconnected because if I do, I know like what's waiting for me at the end of the tunnel, and that's a drink or a drug. And yeah, this episode was really amazing. I think the viewers can take a lot out of it. We talked about a lot of things, sharing our stories, just different experiences that we may have heard, and about the importance of triggers, emotional, mental, and then like
Spiritual.
obvious, yeah, the spiritual triggers, right? And being in those situations in which we shouldn't be. We talked about prevention tools and all those things. What it takes to be sober today for guys like you and I, because I know for myself, like it's really just still one day at a time. Like
Mm.
I everything my life has come to, like every single time I get something good in my life, like I wish that the people talking to me could only know the experience that I had to go through and how important this recovery is. We talk about and we do this class of like hierarchy of values, right? And my hierarchy of value is always God and then recovery and
Yeah.
then all the other stuff. The school, the eventually earning a PhD, the job, the family, whatever it is, it's coming after because I know if I fuck up those two things, everything comes crashing down. And I try and explain that to people because they just try and put those things up first. Like this is my priorities. Man, from my experience, if I don't have those things in set, like I can't be in university right now, like looking at graduate school in a clinical psychology program if I'm using, man. Like there's a fucking bar over there. Like I'd be, man, it's 12 o'clock. Like I'd be fucking face first into the booze right now, Probably calling a guy up, asking for some little nose candy, And I just know that's my story. So,
Yep. Yep. And I would say that, people like you and I who have worked the steps and who have had that spiritual experience or awakening, um, we know now something that is so precious. We've experienced something that's so powerful, which is that life is pretty simple, right? There's 1,000 different reasons why I could be upset or anxious or lonely or sad, right? But there's only one way for me and you to be able to manage those emotions without relapsing or without letting them take us off course, which is the spiritual connection, right?
God.
There's it's God, and then there's this story where there's a monk who was lecturing in India talking about meditation, and somebody stood up and he challenged them, because in
Sure.
India, a lot of people believe that in order to be spiritual or holy, you have to possess some sort of like powers, right? And he says, well, you talk about meditation, but what powers has meditation given you? And then the monk thought about it for a second, because he didn't really have any powers, but he said, actually, it's given me the most important power of all, which is to choose, the ability to choose to be happy in any given circumstance. And you and I, Jama, we have attained that power. We have some very simple tools that allow us to be in that place mentally, emotionally, and
Mm.
spiritually, right? And but ultimately, it's up to me, you, and anybody else who's in recovery to use them or not, right? The choice is ours.
That's so beautiful. That is so beautiful. I want to close with asking you one question. What advice would you give to somebody who's, going through this relapse, recent relapse? What advice would you give to them?
Fake it till you make it. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. When I've been spiritually disconnected, to me, using the tools that we've mentioned in this podcast, like prayer, like meditation, like meetings, they seem like they're not going to work. Or when I pray, I don't feel that connection, right? So what I've learned is that I have to do it even though I don't feel it at the time, right? Because maybe I've fallen a little bit and it's kind of gone, but it's like starting a fire, right? I'm like a damp piece of wood that needs a little bit of work, a little bit of effort, and until I dry out and a spark catches, and suddenly that spark is a flame, right? So if you've relapsed and you feel like all is lost, just remember
Yeah,
it's not. Just use those tools, even though you don't think they're gonna work or they don't feel
yeah,
like they're working. Keep using them, and eventually your recovery will catch fire again.
yeah. Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
What about yourself?
I would say what my trust the process, and that's a saying that my sponsor got on his medallion, and saying that I like. It's a slogan that I would really, really say for people to follow. Like just like you were saying, the process a lot of the times is so untrustworthy. Like you're just like, man, I want things now. I want it now. I want it now. I don't know why I keep fucking up, and like just trust this process, man. Because like if you do, man, there's a whole new life waiting for you that you never would have dreamt. Like the lives that we live now and the happiness we get to experience and raw, authentic happiness walking alongside our higher powers is beyond my wildest dreams. Like I've had experiences because of me trusting the process, even though I felt like shit and it was uncomfortable and I was like literally drowning in uncomfortableness. It's all worth it. Everything I did was worth it. Every single bit of pain and suffering I went through is so worth it today. And so just trust that process and know that you are not alone in, feeling like garbage after a relapse. Like we still love you. God still loves you. And you got to learn how to love yourself again because you're worth it.
Nice. And on that note, I think we should wrap up the show. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode. Hopefully it's been helpful, and we'll see you on the next one. God bless.
God bless.